Jakob Weiss stood inside his cabin, watching through a narrow gap in the shutters as three men stumbled past in the blizzard, bent double against wind that hurled snow horizontally across the mountain valley. They were searching for his woodpile, convinced he must have an external supply somewhere nearby, because no man could stay warm for 6 days straight during a storm like this without running out of fuel. He watched them give up and disappear into the white chaos, heading back toward their own cabins, where their fires were dying and their wood was buried under 4 feet of snow. Jakob turned from the window, opened the trapdoor in his cabin floor, and descended into the chamber below to retrieve another armload of bone-dry firewood that those men would never know existed. Before we dive into how Jakob built something that changed winter survival across the Rocky Mountains, let us know where you're watching from, and if you're fascinated by frontier innovation and survival ingenuity. Hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's story is even more impossible than this one. Jakob Weiss knew something was wrong the moment he saw the cabin door standing open. Snow had drifted halfway across the threshold, white powder spilling onto the dirt floor like an unwelcome guest that had forced its way inside. He'd been gone since dawn checking his trap lines along the creek, and Thomas Hendricks should have been here, should have kept the fire burning, should have kept the door closed against the January cold. Jakob dropped the 3 frozen beaver pelts he'd been carrying and stepped into the cabin. The fire was dead, just gray ash and a few pieces of charred wood that had burned down to nothing hours ago. Thomas's rifle stood in the corner, his coat hung on its peg, his boots were gone. The realization hit Jakob like a physical blow. Thomas had gone outside without his coat, in a Wyoming mountain winter. That meant panic, meant desperation, meant something had gone terribly wrong. Jakob grabbed his own rifle and went back into the storm. The wind had picked up since morning, driving snow so thick he could barely see 20 feet ahead. He followed the only tracks visible, boot prints already half-filled with fresh powder, leading away from the cabin toward the tree line where they kept their woodpile stacked against the weather. He found Thomas Hendricks 30 yards from the cabin, lying face down in snow that had drifted around his body like a burial shroud. In his right hand, Thomas still clutched an empty canvas sack, the kind they used for hauling firewood. Jakob knelt beside his partner and knew without checking that Thomas was dead. The body was frozen solid, hard as the ground beneath the snow. Jakob forced himself to look at the scene with a trapper's eye, reading the story written in disturbed snow and final desperate actions. Thomas had burned through their indoor wood supply. Instead of rationing what remained, he'd let the fire burn hot and fast, probably thinking the storm would break soon. When the fire died and the cabin temperature plummeted, Thomas had panicked. He'd gone out without proper clothing, thinking speed mattered more than preparation. He'd made it to the woodpile. Jakob could see where Thomas had tried to load the sack, could see scattered pieces of split pine in the snow. But the cold had taken him fast. Fingers went numb, thinking became confused. The cabin was only 30 yards away, but in whiteout conditions, 30 yards might as well be 30 miles. Thomas had gotten turned around, walked in the wrong direction, collapsed, and died alone in the storm, while warmth and shelter waited just beyond his failing vision. Jakob pulled Thomas's body back to the cabin, dragging him through snow that fought every step. He laid his partner on the floor and sat beside him, while wind howled outside and the temperature inside dropped toward freezing. They had firewood outside, stacked and ready, enough to last the winter. But Thomas had died trying to reach it. The problem wasn't lack of resources, the problem was access. When storms turned violent, when visibility dropped to nothing, when cold could kill in minutes, having firewood 30 yards away was the same as having no firewood at all. Jakob looked at the cabin walls, at the simple door, at the single room that represented everything most mountain men considered adequate shelter. Thomas Hendricks had been capable and experienced. He died because traditional cabin design assumed you could always step outside when needed. That assumption had just killed Jakob's partner. Jakob would bury Thomas when the storm broke, but first he would survive this night, and then he would figure out how to build shelter that never required a man to risk his life in a storm. Spring came to the Wind River Range in late April of 1842, melting snow and revealing what winter had claimed. Jakob Weiss traveled down from the mountains to Meg Coulter's trading post at the Valley Junction, carrying his season's furs and the weight of Thomas Hendricks' death still heavy on his mind. The trading post was a low-log structure that served as supply depot, meeting place, and informal headquarters for trappers working the surrounding territory. Meg ran it alone since her husband's death 2 years prior, managing inventory and credit with sharp efficiency. Jakob was securing his furs when he heard Red Sam McLeod's distinctive voice from inside. The old Scotsman was holding court with trappers who'd survived the winter, and his words stopped Jakob cold. The Larson brothers didn't make it. Eric and Nils both. Found them in their cabin up Sheep Creek Way, froze to death after their wood ran out. Jakob entered the trading post. 6 men stood around the pot-bellied stove. Their faces showed the wear of a hard winter. "How many?" Jakob asked quietly. Red Sam turned. "German. Heard about Thomas. Sorry for your loss." He paused. "4 dead that we know of. Thomas, the Larsons, and a new man named Cooper. Another 5 abandoned their claims midwinter rather than face another storm. Antoine Broussard, a French-Canadian voyageur with a scar across his cheek, shook his head. Worst winter in 20 years. You go outside in those storms, you die. You stay inside without wood, you freeze. That's mountain life," Red Sam said with the finality of a man who'd seen 23 winters. "Men die, you accept it or you leave." The other trappers nodded. This was established wisdom, the accepted cost of living in the high country. Winter claimed lives the way it claimed everything else that wasn't strong enough. Jakob said nothing, but his silence felt different than acceptance. Meg noticed. She'd been tallying his furs at the counter, watching him with the attention of someone who recognized when a man was thinking rather than just listening. After the others left, she approached him. "You've got that look. Jakob. Thomas used to complain about it. Said you'd get an idea in your head and chew on it like a dog with a bone. What if we didn't store wood outside at all?" Jakob said. Meg tilted her head. "Where else would you store it?" "Under the cabin, in a chamber built into the foundation. You'd load it from outside when weather permitted, but access it from inside. The wood would be protected, dry, and you'd never have to leave shelter to reach it." Red Sam, who was examining traps near the door, laughed. "You planning to live in a mine shaft, German?" Jakob ignored him. He pulled charcoal from his pocket and began sketching on the wooden counter. Lines became walls, walls became structure, structure became something none of them had seen before. "How much would the iron hardware cost?" Jakob asked. Meg studied the sketch. She'd seen enough desperate ideas from mountain men to recognize the difference between fantasy and something that might work. "More than you made this season," she said. "But I'll extend you credit. You build this and it works. I want to know about it." Jakob nodded. That was all he needed. Late spring of 1842 found Jakob Weiss standing on a slight rise 2 miles from where Thomas had died, studying terrain with the careful attention his father had taught him decades ago in Bavaria. Johann Weiss had been a stonemason, and he drilled into young Jakob that a structure's strength came from what you built below ground, not above it. Jakob had selected this spot for specific reasons. The elevation provided drainage so snowmelt and rain would flow away rather than pool around the foundation. A rock outcrop to the northwest would break prevailing winter winds. Dense pine growth on 3 sides offered additional wind protection while still allowing southern sun exposure. He drove stakes into the ground, marking an 8-foot by 12-foot rectangle. Most trappers would start cutting logs now, racing to complete a cabin before weather turned. Jakob sat down with charcoal and paper, sketching plans that drew on memories of his father's voice. The innovation forming in Jakob's mind was radical by frontier standards. Instead of building a cabin on the ground, he would build it over a hollow space. The cabin would rest on stone walls that enclosed an underground chamber. That chamber would store firewood, accessible from both outside and inside through separate doors. The engineering challenge was significant. How deep should he dig? 6 feet would put the floor below the frost line while staying above bedrock. How would he support the cabin's weight over hollow space? Stone walls on 3 sides, with the cabin's own foundation logs forming the 4th wall. Heavy timber beams would span the chamber width, supporting floor planks that became the chamber's ceiling. Access would require 2 openings. A trapdoor in the cabin floor would allow interior access via a ladder. An external loading door built into the foundation would let him throw wood into the chamber from outside. The system would separate loading from retrieval, letting him bulk load during good weather and retrieve from inside during storms. Jakob worked through problems on paper. Water drainage required a sloped floor leading to the external door. Ventilation needed a shaft to prevent suffocation and moisture buildup. The external door required protection from snow accumulation. Every detail mattered because failure underground could mean burial or collapse. Peter Dunham, a young trapper working a claim 3 miles away, rode up as Jakob was sketching beam placements. Peter was 26, in only his second year in the mountains, still enthusiastic where older trappers had become resigned. Most men just stack logs and call it done, Peter said, looking at the detailed drawings. Most men freeze when storms come, Jakob replied without looking up. Peter studied the sketches. You're serious about this. Building down before you build up. My father built foundations that held churches for 200 years. I'm building one that needs to hold for 20 winters. You'll need help with the heavy beams. Jakob looked up. You offering? I watched Thomas freeze last winter. I'd rather not do the same. Peter dismounted. When do we start? Jakob handed him a shovel. Now. They broke ground that afternoon, driving the first shovel into earth that would become Jakob's underground chamber. The work ahead would take months. But Jakob had learned that speed killed men like Thomas. Careful planning and patient construction kept them alive. The hole they were digging represented more than shelter. It represented the difference between accepting death as inevitable and engineering survival into the foundation itself. Summer of 1842 brought long days and the backbreaking work of excavation. Jakob and Peter removed earth one shovelful at a time, digging a rectangular pit 8 feet wide, 10 feet long, and 6 feet deep. The work was monotonous and exhausting. Lift, throw, repeat. 40 cubic yards of dirt and rock moved by hand over 2 weeks. Jakob's perfectionism frustrated Peter. Every wall had to be perfectly vertical, checked constantly with a plumb line Jakob had fashioned from cord and a stone weight. The floor had to be level except for a slight slope toward where the external door would be. It's just a hole, Jakob, Peter said on the 5th day, wiping sweat from his face. Close enough is good enough. Close enough gets you killed when the ceiling collapses under the cabin's weight, Jakob replied. Checking the north wall's angle for the 3rd time that hour, Peter learned to stop arguing and start watching. He began to see what Jakob saw, that precision in excavation meant stability and structure, that every measurement mattered because this hole would support tons of weight. When excavation finished, stone gathering began. Jakob needed flat stones for the walls, hundreds of them. The nearest source was a creek bed 2 miles away, where water had smoothed and fractured stones into usable pieces. They spent 3 weeks hauling stones. Each stone was evaluated before transport. Jakob rejected rounded stones, stones with cracks, stones that were too thick or too thin. He wanted pieces roughly rectangular, 12 to 18 inches across, flat enough to stack with minimal gaps. Peter carried stones in a canvas sack. Jakob carried them in a leather harness he'd designed that distributed weight across his back and chest. They made 4 trips daily, returning with 30 to 40 stones each trip. The pile beside the excavation grew slowly. Antoine Broussard visited during the 3rd week. The French-Canadian trapper stood at the edge of the pit, looking at the stone pile, then at Jakob and Peter's dirt-covered clothes. "Building a palace for rats? German?" Antoine said, grinning. Jakob was fitting stones together on the ground, testing which pieces would work, beside each other. "Building something that works," he said without looking up. Antoine watched for a few minutes, shook his head, and rode off. Peter noticed he looked back twice before disappearing into the trees. Wall construction began in early July. Jakob used dry stacking, fitting stones together without mortar. Each stone was placed to interlock with those around it, creating structural strength through weight and friction. Between stones, Jakob packed his clay horsehair resin mixture, filling gaps and creating a seal against moisture. The mixture itself took 3 days to prepare. Jakob dug clay from a riverbank, collected horsehair from a wild horse carcass, and boiled pine resin for hours. He mixed these ingredients in precise proportions, working the mixture until it reached the consistency he wanted. Peter learned to pack it between stones, pressing it deep into gaps, smoothing the surface. The walls rose slowly. 6 inches per day was good progress. By late July, stone sating day. The walls stood 6 feet tall on 3 sides of the chamber, with the 4th side left open where the cabin's foundation logs would eventually form the interior wall. Late summer of 1842 brought Jakob's biggest engineering challenge, building a ceiling strong enough to support an entire cabin over a hollow chamber. This was where theory would meet reality, where his father's stonemason principles would either prove sound or fail catastrophically. Jakob needed timber beams, but not just any logs. He spent 4 days searching the surrounding forest for trees with specific characteristics: straight grain, minimal taper, approximately 12 inches in diameter, and no rot or insect damage. He found 6 suitable pines and felled them carefully, cutting 12-foot lengths that would span the 8-foot chamber width with 2 feet of overlap on each side for support. Peter helped drag the beams to the construction site using a horse Jakob had borrowed from Meg Coulter. Each beam weighed roughly 300 pounds. Moving them required leverage, rope, and patience. The beams had to rest securely on the stone walls. Jakob notched the top course of stones on opposite walls, creating pockets that would cradle each beam and prevent lateral movement. He spaced the beams 3 feet apart, giving him 4 beams total, spanning the chamber. "What if the cabin falls into the hole?" Peter asked as they positioned the first beam. Jakob had asked himself the same question. His answer came from understanding load distribution. Weight spreads across multiple beams. Each beam transfers load to stone walls transfer to earth. As long as beams don't span too far and walls are solid, structure holds. You sound certain. I am. My father built cathedral foundations using these principles. Cathedrals are still standing. They tested the first beam by loading it with stones, piling weight in the center until they'd added roughly 500 pounds. The beam sagged, slightly, but held. Jakob examined the notched supports, checked for cracking, found none. He nodded, and they continued. By early August, all 4 beams were positioned and secured. Across these beams, Jakob laid split planks perpendicular to the beam direction. The planks were 3 inches thick, fitted tightly together, and pegged to the beams with wooden dowels Jakob had whittled during evening hours. Over the planks went a layer of birch bark for waterproofing. Over the bark, Jakob spread his clay mixture in a 1/2-inch layer, sealing every gap. The result was a composite ceiling: timber for strength, bark for moisture barrier, clay for insulation, and additional sealing. Before building the cabin walls on top, Jakob insisted on a final test. He and Peter both climbed onto the completed ceiling and jumped, testing its ability to handle dynamic loads. The structure didn't flex, didn't crack, didn't show any sign of weakness. Red Sam McLeod arrived that afternoon, drawn by curiosity about what the German had been building all summer. He examined the chamber, the stone walls, the ceiling structure. He walked around the perimeter twice, then stood at the edge looking down into the space. "It's sound work, German," Sam said finally. "Still think you're crazy, but it's sound." Jakob accepted the compliment without comment. Validation from a man with 23 winters of experience meant the engineering was solid. Now came the next phase: cutting the access opening and beginning cabin construction. Early autumn of 1842 brought the critical phase, building the access points that would make Jakob's chamber functional. The cabin structure stood complete above the chamber, walls rising solid and tight. Now Jakob focused on the doors that would connect outside to chamber and chamber to inside. The external loading door demanded Jakob's perfectionism. This door would face weather, wildlife, and the test of time. He selected planks from the densest pine he could find, cutting them to 3 inches thick. Each plank was shaped with his draw knife until surfaces were smooth and edges were perfectly straight. He fitted the planks using tongue and groove joinery, each board interlocking with the next. When assembled, they formed a door 30 inches wide and 40 inches tall, thick enough to stop a bear and heavy enough to require 2 men to lift. Peter watched Jakob spend an entire week on this single door. "You could have built 2 cabins by now," Peter said, not complaining but genuinely amazed at the time investment. "2 cabins a bear could break into," Jakob replied, planing a plank edge for the fourth time. "I'm building one, it can't." The door's interior face received diagonal iron brackets forming an X pattern. Jakob had purchased these from Meg on credit, expensive frontier iron that cost more than a month's worth of pelts. He bolted the brackets through the planks using square-cut nails that were clinched over on the exterior side. The hinges were mortised into both the door and the foundation logs. Jakob cut rectangular pockets in the wood, deep enough that the hinges sat flush. Then he bolted them through with iron pins. To remove these hinges, someone would have to destroy the logs themselves. The door couldn't be torn off, only broken through. A heavy wooden beam served as the locking mechanism. Jakob mounted iron brackets to the stone walls inside the chamber. The beam slid through these brackets and engaged with a mortise cut into the adjacent wall. When locked, the beam connected the door directly to the stone structure. The internal trapdoor received equal attention. Jakob built it into the cabin floor near the back wall, a 3-foot square opening with the same thick plank construction. But this door opened downward into the chamber, hinged on one edge so it would swing down and rest against the interior wall when open. A rope handle recessed into the trapdoor's surface allowed it to be pulled closed from below. From above, the door sat flush with the floor, disguised under a bearskin rug that made it invisible to casual observation. Jakob constructed a wooden ladder and mounted it permanently to the chamber's interior wall. 6 feet tall with rungs spaced 12 inches apart, it provided easy access between cabin and chamber. The final element was a protective canopy above the external door. Jakob extended roof logs 2 feet past the foundation, creating an overhang that would deflect snow away from the loading entrance. Testing came next. Jakob and Peter simulated forced entry, pushing and prying against both doors. Everything held. Jakob threw split firewood through the external door, then entered the cabin, opened the trapdoor, descended, and retrieved the wood. The system worked exactly as designed. Late November of 1842 brought the test Jakob had been preparing for since Thomas died. He'd spent October splitting and stacking firewood, storing 150 pieces in the underground chamber and maintaining an external pile as well. The redundancy was intentional. If the system failed, he wanted backup options. The storm announced itself 3 days in advance. Temperature dropped sharply. Wind shifted to the northwest. Animals moved to shelter with the urgency that comes from instinct older than human memory. Jakob recognized these signs from 11 winters in the mountains. He spent the day before the storm's arrival loading the chamber completely. He threw split pine through the external door, listening to each piece clatter onto the stone floor below. When finished, he secured the external door from inside the chamber, sliding the heavy beam lock into place, then climbed the ladder and closed the trapdoor above him. The storm arrived at dawn. Wind-driven snow reduced visibility to nothing within hours. Jakob kept his fire burning steadily, watching through a narrow gap in the shutters as the world outside became white chaos. The psychological challenge was harder than he'd anticipated. Every instinct said to check the external woodpile, to verify supplies, to do something active. Sitting inside while snow piled higher felt wrong, despite knowing the chamber held everything he needed. Day 2 tested his discipline. The fire consumed wood steadily. By afternoon, his indoor supply was depleted. This was the moment. Either the system worked, or he faced the same choice that killed Thomas: brave the storm or freeze. Jakob moved the bearskin rug aside and opened the trapdoor. Cold air rose from the chamber below, but nothing like the killing cold outside. He descended the ladder, his boots finding rungs in practiced movements. The chamber was dark except for light from the open trapdoor above. He gathered an armload of wood, climbed back up, and closed the trapdoor. The entire process took 30 seconds. He was breathing slightly harder from the climb, but otherwise unchanged. No exposure to wind, no snow, no risk. The relief was profound. It worked exactly as designed. Storm intensity increased on day 3. Through the shutter gap, Jakob saw shapes moving past his cabin. 3 men, bent against wind that hurled snow horizontally. He recognized their builds: Red Sam, Antoine, and another trapper named Morrison. They were searching the area around his cabin, looking for his woodpile. Jakob understood immediately. They'd seen smoke from his chimney for 3 days straight. They knew he was burning wood. But they couldn't find his supply. In their minds, he had to have an external pile somewhere accessible, even in this storm. He watched them circle his cabin twice before giving up. They never looked at the foundation. The dark opening beneath the protective canopy just looked like structural shadow. The secret held. When the storm broke on day 4, Jakob emerged to find his external woodpile buried under 4 feet of snow. Retrieving it would require hours of digging, but his fire had never faltered because his real supply had been underground, protected, accessible, without ever stepping outside. December of 1842 brought a different kind of validation. Jakob returned from checking his trap lines on a cold afternoon to find fresh tracks in the snow around his cabin. Large paw prints, each one bigger than his hand, spread wide. A grizzly bear, male based on the size, had visited while he was gone. Jakob followed the tracks, reading the story they told. The bear had approached from the east, circled the cabin twice, and tested multiple points. Deep claw marks scarred the main cabin door where the animal had pushed and scratched. More marks appeared around the corners where logs met, but the most concerning evidence was at the external loading door. The bear had discovered the foundation entrance. Snow around it was disturbed from sustained attention. Claw marks gouged the thick planks, long scratches that spoke of considerable force applied. Jakob knelt beside the door, examining the damage with growing concern. The planks showed surface scoring but no structural compromise. The hinges remained secure, still mortised deep into the foundation logs. The door itself hadn't moved even slightly from its frame. The iron brackets inside had distributed the force across multiple points, preventing any single area from failing. That night, Jakob was inside the cabin when he heard sounds outside. Heavy footfalls in snow, breathing that wasn't wind. He moved to the gun port, a narrow slit he'd built into the wall that allowed him to observe without exposing himself. The grizzly had returned. In the moonlight reflecting off snow, Jakob could see the animal clearly. It was massive, probably weighing 700 pounds, with the humped shoulders and dish-shaped face of a mature male. The bear moved with purpose, not randomly exploring, but methodically testing. It approached the main door first, pushing against it with one massive paw. The door rattled, slightly, but held. The bear pushed harder, throwing its weight forward. Nothing. It scratched at the door frame, trying to widen gaps or find weakness. Jakob watched through the gun port, his rifle loaded but not raised. He wanted to see if the structure could defend itself without him defending it. The bear moved to the external loading door. This received the most attention. For 15 minutes, Jakob watched the animal work at the door with intelligence that surprised him. It tried to get claws under the door's edge. It bit at the corners where door met frame. It reared up and came down on the door with both front paws, a blow that would have shattered standard construction. The door absorbed the impact with a solid thud but no give. The beam lock on the interior held firm. The mortised hinges didn't budge. The iron brackets distributed force exactly as designed. Eventually, the bear gave up. It circled the cabin one more time, sniffing and testing, then wandered back into the darkness. Jakob lowered his rifle, never having needed to fire it. In the morning, Peter arrived to find Jakob examining new claw marks. "You were inside during this?" Peter asked, touching the deep gouges. Jakob nodded. "The door did the fighting for me." Spring through summer of 1843 transformed Jakob from solitary innovator to reluctant teacher. Peter Dunham began construction on his own chamber system in May, and Jakob found himself supervising and advising someone else's build for the first time. Peter's site was 3 miles from Jakob's cabin on similar elevated terrain with good drainage. They started with excavation, and Jakob watched Peter measure and remeasure dimensions with the same obsessive care Jakob had demanded of himself. The challenge came with materials. Peter had trapped for only 2 seasons. He couldn't afford the iron hardware that made Jakob's doors nearly impenetrable. They stood in Meg Coulter's trading post, discussing alternatives. "Wooden reinforcements," Jakob said finally. "Cross-bracing on the door interior. Multiple wooden pins instead of iron brackets. It won't be as strong, but the principles still work." Peter's chamber took shape over 6 weeks. Stone walls rose through techniques Jakob had refined. The ceiling beams went up with careful attention to load distribution. The doors were built with available materials rather than ideal ones, but they were solid and functional. Red Sam MacLeod appeared at Jakob's cabin in late June. The old Scotsman dismounted without greeting, walked to the chamber entrance, and stood looking at it for a long moment. "Show me how you did the ceiling beams," Sam said finally. No apology for earlier mockery, no admission that Jakob had been right. But the request itself was acknowledgement enough. Jakob spent an afternoon walking Sam through every aspect of construction, from excavation depth to ventilation shaft placement. "You're giving this away for free?" Sam asked. "I'm keeping people alive. That's worth more than pelts." Sam nodded slowly. "I'll start building in August." "Ground's too frozen up my way right now." Word spread through the scattered trapping community. By midsummer, Jakob had visited 4 different sites, advising on chamber construction. Each build was slightly different based on terrain, available materials, and builder's skill level, but the core principles remained consistent. Chief Washakie of the Shoshone arrived in early autumn, accompanied by 2 younger men. The chief had heard about the white trapper who built underground, and curiosity brought him to see it himself. Through a mixture of hand signs and broken English, Jakob showed Washakie the chamber system. The chief examined everything with careful attention, then spoke through one of his companions who knew more English. "My people store food underground many generations. You learn what we always know. Earth protects what wind destroys." Washakie shared Shoshone techniques. Underground storage, how they lined pits with stones to prevent moisture, how they created air channels to keep food from rotting, how they disguised entrances from animals. Jakob realized his innovation was actually rediscovery, different cultures arriving at the same solution. By October, 5 cabins in the region had functioning chamber systems. Meg's trading post saw increased demand for excavation tools and what iron hardware she could stock. She told Jakob that his idea was changing how people prepared for winter. Antoine Broussard, traveling through, spread stories to other trappers. He exaggerated, claiming Jakob's chamber could hold 1,000 logs, but the core message reached distant camps. There was a way to survive storms without fighting them. Winter of 1843 to 1844 tested every cabin in the Wind River Range. The season brought record cold, storms that lasted weeks, and conditions that made the previous winter look mild by comparison. Old trappers who'd seen 25 seasons said they'd never experienced anything like it. But the 6 cabins with chamber systems survived without crisis. Jakob spent the winter comfortable and safe, descending his ladder when needed, retrieving wood without ever facing the killing wind outside. Peter made it through his 3rd winter because Jakob had taught him to build differently. Red Sam, grudging but alive, endured storms that would have broken his old cabin's defenses. 2 trappers without chamber systems died that winter. 3 others abandoned their claims in January, walking out rather than face another month of fighting for firewood access. The difference between survival and failure came down to infrastructure built the previous summer. Spring brought an informal gathering at Meg Coulter's trading post. The men who'd survived stood around her stove, and the conversation was different than previous years. No acceptance of death as inevitable, no resignation to mountain brutality. Instead, there was discussion of construction techniques, chamber dimensions, and planning for next season. Red Sam spoke what others were thinking. The German was right. "I'm alive because I swallowed my pride and built like he showed me," Peter added. "Youngest man here. Survived because someone taught me that winter doesn't have to kill you if you build smart." Jakob said little during these conversations. The validation wasn't in words but in living faces, in men who'd returned from winter intact because they'd changed how they approached shelter. His relationship with Meg deepened through that spring. They'd built something beyond merchant and customer, beyond respect, into something that felt like partnership. When he asked if she'd consider leaving the trading post for a different life, she said yes without hesitation. Jakob left the mountains in 1846. He and Meg established a small ranch in lower elevation country near Fort Bridger, a trading post named for the famous scout. He continued to advise settlers heading west, sketching chamber designs on paper and explaining the principles his father had taught him decades ago in Bavaria. Over the following years, dozens of cabins were built using variations of Jacob's technique. Some trappers added their own innovations. Some simplified the design based on available materials. But the core concept spread. Underground storage, dual access, protection from the elements, built into the foundation itself. Jacob Weiss died in 1868 at age 60, a quiet rancher whose mountain years had faded into private memory. But in the high country, abandoned cabins with stone-lined chambers still stood, some occupied by new settlers, some empty but intact, all testament to one man's refusal to accept that winter should be deadly. The impossible had become routine. A man could survive any storm, not by fighting it, but by building so well the storm couldn't reach him. And Jacob's legacy wasn't carved in stone or written in books. It was built into foundations scattered across the Rockies, hidden chambers that saved lives in ways no one would ever fully count.